Hello and welcome to episode 97 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we are talking about the final CDL roster to be officially announced, as well as giving our power rankings or tier lists. And we're going to have a discussion about GAs in Call of Duty, and because that's been a very big topic in the community as of late. And whatever we have other than that we can get to during the show, as we're getting really, really close to the beginning of the 2024 CDL season. And next week will be our first prediction show for the season, so it should be a lot of fun. But before we get to that show and before we get to any of the topics, how are you doing, Bink?
I'm doing all right. Like you said, the season is quickly approaching, faster than it may have seemed just a couple weeks ago, and yeah, we're getting down back into the swing of things. So I'm ready to jump right in.
Yeah, so happy Thanksgiving to anybody that celebrated. Hope you had a really good and very food-filled weekend. I certainly did. I felt like 25 pounds heavier when I came back from my parents' house. But that really helped get through some of the time. That was like 5 or 6 days that just kind of blew by, and that's 5 or 6 days closer to the beginning of the CDL season. And before we get to the beginning of the season, we actually had to get a confirmation from the final team in the CDL that had not announced their roster, the Los Angeles Guerrillas. They announced earlier today that their roster will be Assault, Fame, Estriel, and Diamond Con, which is a confirmation of the roster that we had seen from the reports and the leaks over the past few weeks. I guess just to kind of wrap it all up, any thoughts on this roster specifically? We know that it was at some point reportedly set to be gunless and Asim and Diamond Con, but now we have this new roster of Assault, Fame, Estro, and Diamond Con. So what are you thinking about them now?
Yeah, I don't think I have much to add on that front. I just think that the drama and everything that happened beforehand means that these guys have a little more pressure on their shoulders. Not necessarily pressure, I guess, but the spotlight's going to be on them a little bit. Um, we talked about it when we last talked about this roster, but I just think as that last team to officially form a roster, they kind of put themselves um, behind the eight ball a little bit in comparison to some of these other teams that have been around, formed for longer. And there's organizational circumstances to that and all that stuff behind the scenes, but it's definitely not a position you want to be in heading into the season. But they do have like low expectations in the community seemingly. So seemingly the only place they can go from here is up, and their goal in my eyes at least should be to prove some people wrong and prove that they belong in the league. I do think for someone like Assault, this could potentially be one of his last shots in the league. It feels like it's kind of strange to think of him as a veteran, but he really is. We were just talking about he was champs MVP in 2018, which is 5 years ago now at this point, almost 6 when we're into the season next year. So um, he's been doing it for a while, which is kind of crazy to think about in retrospect when you think about some other veterans in comparison. But if this team doesn't work out for him, it could potentially be his last shot in the league. And just taking into consideration, he was back in Challengers last year, got a shot on LAG, and then they had that stretch, honeymoon phase, whatever you want to call it, where they were looking strong, and Hardpoint in particular, when that roster, 3/4 of the LAG Academy team came up to the main squad with Arcides. They had a strong start there, where they looked like they might make some noise, but then after that, it was really not much to write home about for that squad. So, yeah, that's really the main thing for me. Guys like Diamond Khan, this is his second chance in the league. Someone like Fame got like half a chance really towards the end of last year.
Yeah.
I believe Diamond Con had a full year with NYSL in Cold War, if I remember correctly, but maybe it wasn't even a full year. They had a lot of swaps there when Clay took a break, and
I think he was
they had the
benched at
Hydra
some point, but I
visas.
don't know if
Yeah, so I mean, regardless, him and Fame, we'll just say for the lack of uh, finality there that they have potentially less than a full year in the CDL between them both. So, um, yeah, I just think that that squad is in that position that I kind of already outlined, where um, they're kind of starting from the bottom and they really only have up to go. So, will be interesting to see how they perform if they are able to prove any of the doubters wrong. And because the season's so close at this point, we don't have to wait much longer to see them in action.
Yeah, and I wanted to point out the coaching staff because they actually have a head coach that we've talked about Vos, who was kind of like the center of, I don't want to say drama because he really didn't do very much to deserve to be at the center of it, but a lot of focus was on him. But they also have an assistant coach, Chitsaz, which I think is Arian on COD Gamepedia. And then there is an analyst, it's Cheek, which I guess him and Chitsaz are brothers, I would imagine. They both have the same last name. So, which obviously like a 3-person coaching staff, it's not like super rare in Call of Duty, but considering there's been a lot of doubt about the Guerrillas, their kind of financial status, their standing in the league, they now have 3 people that are presumably supporting the team in a coaching role or an analyst role, which is impressive. Even if it is quite a low bar, I would imagine that Vos is the substitute if I had to take a stab at it. But still pretty impressive, and it does make sense to have these 3 people together because they won the 2022 Challengers Finals, and they were all on the same coaching staff. That was Ironblood Gaming won that with Brat, Classic, Exceed, and Mohawk. And Vos was a coach. So was Arian, and so was Cheek, along with Sharp. Not the TK Sharp, but another one, an English one. So that they have some familiarity with each other. I believe Cheek was also either an assistant coach or an analyst for the Mutineers last year under Willett. So he has some experience there. And Arian was, I believe, an assistant or maybe an analyst for LAG last year. So I think that's interesting. A lot of different perspectives, you would imagine, and they have some familiarity with each other, which is always great. Do you think, like, what do you think, I guess, of just having 3 assistants slash analysts on your roster for LAG, considering we didn't know if they would even be able to field a team this year?
I mean, that's got to be a positive in some aspect. The willingness to invest in a staff like that. We've seen it before. They had Bevels and Ricky, and last year they had Marky B and Mayhem. So in previous years, LAG has been one of the teams to have multiple coaches on several occasions. But yeah, given the circumstances of the organization and everything behind the scenes, like you kind of outlined, it is a little surprising this year. But I mean, that's definitely something that can help the team, because the more eyes you have on that gameplay, um, the better chance you have of somebody seeing something that might fix things, or be that crucial bit of information that can make the difference in a 250, 249 game or round 11, all that good stuff. So definitely a positive in my eyes that they're able to pull it off.
Yeah, definitely. Let's move on to the tier list, the power rankings that we promised at the top of the show. We've talked about quite a bit on the show that we're both not the biggest fan of traditional power rankings, 1 through 12, because especially when you're in a preseason power ranking situation, how do you even rank the 8th best team versus the 9th best team when you haven't seen some of these teams? I haven't seen at all scrim, and some of these teams I've only seen from the other point of view of the opposing team, watching Temp stream, and they're scrimming Boston. So I haven't really seen Boston's point of view. I haven't heard them as a team. I have seen a little bit of Carolina, but there's very limited scrims that we actually have look on and to kind of base our opinions on. So this is more of a gut feeling, at least for us. And I created my power rankings, or excuse me, it's a tier list that can kind of serve as power rankings. So let me pull that up real quick. So if you're watching on YouTube or you're watching on Twitch, twitch.tv/Ego Chall Podcast, you can kind of get a view of the tier list and who I have at the top and who I have at the bottom. So I split it into five tiers, with the fifth being more of a joke tier, not really the most serious. But at the top, I have the New York Subliners in their own tier, and I labeled it best until proven otherwise, because they were definitively the best team by the end of the year last season, and I think they even improved their roster with Sib replacing Priesta. Whether that is borne out and we actually get to see that remains to be seen, because we've had that happen before, where a good roster or a great roster on paper gets even better. They add who I would consider a more talented player, and that somehow throws it off. Or just coming into a different game in MW3, that could be the change that maybe they regress coming into this season. Maybe they're not as good as they were at the end of last year. But I'm going to put them at the top without having seen any of their scrims, without having really heard anything about how they're performing in practice. I'm going to put them at the very top, and they're just going to stay there until we actually have official matches to go off of. In the second tier, I have contenders, and 3 teams are in this tier: the Atlanta FaZe, Optic Texas, and Toronto Ultra. I think it's pretty clear that these 3 teams with New York are the most talented teams in the league on paper. Of course, things can change once we actually get into matches, but I think there's no way you can leave out Atlanta FaZe. Optic Texas, despite having a really poor end of the year last season, I still think they have one of, if not the most talented roster. And then Toronto Ultra got to grand finals of champs, had beaten the New York Subliners in the I think it was winners bracket finals of champs, and they laid an egg in the grand finals. And then they came into the offseason and got Envoy added to their roster. And I think they're in a similar situation to New York, that I would expect them to be even better than they were last year, because as much as I like Hixie, I still think Envoy is the better player. Whether that turns out to be the right move, maybe Hixie was actually better for the team, despite maybe not being as talented or whatever, in my opinion, as Envoy. Maybe it would have worked out better for Hixie or with Hixie, but we'll have to figure that out once we get to actual matches. So that's my second tier. My third tier is I see potential. And that tier has 4 teams: the Las Vegas Legion, the Minnesota Rocker, the Seattle Surge, and the Los Angeles Thieves. I don't think any one of these 4 teams are spectacular. I think there's talent on them. I think each team has something where I could definitely see them being a contender for maybe the 4th team in the league. Maybe Toronto or New York or one of those top 4 teams, maybe they falter and they really have to be on their game to avoid slipping out of the top 4. And one of these 4 teams, the Legion, the Rocker, the Surge, or LAT, they could replace them. But I think these are kind of the middle of the road teams, and probably teams that I think are solidly competing for a playoff spot by the end of the year. At this point in time, obviously a lot will change in the next 7 or 8 months. The 4th tier is lovable underdogs, and this is a Mutineers logo because this is from last year's logo set. But the Miami Heretics, the Boston Breach, and the Carolina Royal Ravens are in this tier. I think these 3 teams are definitely not the most talented on paper. There's definitely some potential here, but I think they're each a tier below the teams I listed in the above tier. Miami, I have no idea how they're going to play, because none of these players, aside from Vickle, have been in the CDL in years, and in some cases, like Eric Boom, have never been in the CDL. With Boston, this is a completely different roster. Snoopy, we saw one event with him. Slasher's on a new team. Priesta is on a new team. And Capsule is returning from a year in Florida. So I'm not really sure what to make of them. And then Carolina, I think I just don't see it really with them. I don't see that they're definitely a top four team, and I don't really see them as like a fifth or sixth team. Maybe they can compete for a top seven spot, but I would still have them in this tier. And then the last tier, I have the Guerrillas by themselves, which again is more of a joking tier. I don't. I actually think they're in the lovable underdogs as well, but I am not convinced that they're going to be anything above that. I've kind of learned over the years not to think too much of LAG and to expect as little as possible, and maybe they'll be able to exceed those expectations. But yeah, that's my tier list. I did want to or you can kind of give your thoughts if you agree or disagree, and we can kind of create your own tier list just by, obviously you might not have the same little blurbs or same little tier names, but I think in general you might have some disagreements with this.
Yeah, I think my breakdown that I've been going through, and I've said it on a couple episodes now, is kind of like a splitting it into thirds essentially of three groups of four teams. I think we really agree there on the top four with New York, Atlanta, Optic, and Toronto in no particular order. Those should be the top four teams heading into this game, and especially based on last year's results and based on um, just the rosters on paper. The one area where I kind of disagree is where you have Boston and Carolina. I would have them in my middle four section. So what I did was I had Boston, LAT, Carolina, and Minnesota in like my middle four as like the 5 through 8 teams essentially on paper. In no particular order there either. But I do think where you kind of had you were saying like Carolina maybe not fifth or sixth, maybe like seventh or eighth. So I think I kind of agree with that. But that's I feel like I haven't really watched a ton of their scrims, but I know Clay's been streaming them, and I feel like I've seen some solid results um, out of out of just like the screenshots. So um, I wouldn't be surprised if they were able to be like one of those seventh, eighth teams, a team fighting for that like last playoff spot heading into champ sort of deal. And then my bottom tier would kind of be some of the later teams to announce their rosters outside of Heretics, obviously, but Heretics is a pretty big question mark. Um, and that's one thing we talked about too, just with that team in general. Even when they were in the CWL, it's kind of the same thing where people were they had low expectations for them and expecting them to not do well, and they kind of uh, performed better than a lot of people expected and turned some heads. So I'm expecting they could potentially do that. Um, Again this year, but I would tend to have them in this bottom section here with Seattle. There's a lot of questions. I have been hearing, I feel like some people have been saying some good things about Seattle recently, which could benefit from an AR heavy meta if they're able to run like a 3 AR setup and potentially even 4. I mean, who kind of AR isn't the worst option in the world. So, but definitely like a 3 AR meta when we've heard good things about a Booza and an AR, and then obviously Arcides and Illy. Seattle could definitely turn some heads there, and then see LAG and Vegas would round out that bottom section for me. So that's kind of just how I broke it down. Kind of like you said, though, a lot could change. I feel like Minnesota is one of those other teams that I'm not really sure what to make out of them. They're probably in the like seventh, eighth category, along with Carolina, but I wouldn't be surprised if we had that top four, and then maybe LAT and Boston are 5, 6 in some order, and then it's like a really close fight for 7, 8 between like Minnesota, Carolina, Seattle, and Miami.
Mhm.
So that's kind of where my head's at. Like you said, it's really early. I mean, I really haven't even watched too many scrims on this game. So I mean, just for the sake of a dramatic example, there's a world where New York is somehow a completely different team in MW3 as opposed to MW2, and they just come out of the gates flat. And then we look stupid for having this early tier list. So that's why I'm not a huge fan of the tier list and the power rankings, but I think it's a good exercise and something uh, positive to kind of just break down a little bit heading into the season. And it'll be fun to look back on this list, both of our lists after the season is over, and just see how right or how wrong we really were in the end.
Yeah, I think the main problem with power rankings in a lot of cases is that there's there people try to move around power rankings a lot based on recent results, and I guess that's kind of the exercise. But at the end of the day, I look at power rankings as who you think can win a championship if it ended today. And obviously right now we have very little idea of multiple teams on this list about how they'll play and how they'll fit. Like even FaZe, for example, we've never seen Draza with them. I would expect that they're going to be incredible because Draza is a great player, and FaZe for the last or since the CDL started essentially has been a great team, but I can't guarantee that. But getting back to what I was actually saying is, you say Optic goes like I don't know 5-2 in the first qualifiers, and FaZe goes 7-0, and then Ultra for some reason go like 2-5. Like if I see something in Ultra that I think, oh, this team can't work, then I'm gonna put them pretty low on a power rankings list. But in general, I'm not gonna put Toronto lower than LAG, even if LAG might have one more win than Toronto in the qualifiers, just as an example, because I think there's more potential for Toronto. I still think that the ceiling is higher for Toronto than LAG. That's my main problem with power rankings. And preseason power rankings are ridiculous in general. Just looking at college football, you look at a preseason poll, like that thing is ridiculous. That there's no way that you can ever predict things accurately. You're basically just going off of like rumors and just thoughts and feelings, and it doesn't work out really well for any sport, especially esports. But I think that your tier list of 1 through 4, 5 through 8, 9 through 12 as more of a general rule, I think that's a lot not easier necessarily, but more accurate. And if you're trying to look at the entire scope of like kind of the upward mobility essentially of a team, I think that works. And I think also the tier list that I had, obviously these things are really fluid because we don't know what's going to happen with them. But having more tiers is probably better because they can kind of move around, and it works out better. But from what we've seen over the past few years, it seems that there is like a top 5 generally. That top 5 is usually Atlanta, Optic, Toronto, New York, and LAT. Those 5 teams seem to be kind of hovering around like within the top 5 at all times, with Boston sometimes being able to kind of, I think at some point they were 3rd or 4th for a little bit over the past 2 years, which is really impressive. But in general, those seem to be the top 5 teams, and then you have the bottom feeders, the teams that are almost always near the bottom of the standings, and that's usually LAT, or not LAT, LAG, Vegas, Florida has been kind of staying down there a little bit too much. Now Carolina with London was definitely one of those teams. And Boston and Minnesota have been more consistent in staying in the middle of the pack. Seattle has kind of improved over the last few years with since that pred roster. So who knows what's going to happen with them now? But I seem to have a little more faith in them than you do at the moment. But again, everything can change. We'll know pretty much by Christmas that maybe some of these are completely out of whack, and we need to really reassess where these teams are ranked and how they're tiered. But yeah, that does it for our power rankings and tier list. I'd probably just leak the notes on our stream, but yeah, I think that does it for the tier list. That seems like a good place to leave it. We'll try to update or kind of look back at those tier lists as we go through the season. Maybe we could check in on them every major or before every major. Maybe before the majors, we can kind of give our thoughts on who are actual contenders versus who are not nearly in that same place heading into the tournaments. Next thing that we wanted to talk about are GAs, because that seems to be a very big point of contention and a big topic of discussion in the CDL community or the COD community, and among CDL players lately. This idea of GAs, also known or formerly known as gentlemen's agreements. And the idea of them is really simple. Players are taking action into their own hands. They are, when the developers or the studio or the league is not banning something, they decide, well, we're going to just agree not to use this thing, or we're agreeing to change the way we do certain things to help the competitive landscape of our scene. And I think that's a really simple way of looking at it, and that's like the basic idea behind it. But I would argue that not necessarily that pros are going too far, but that they're being used incorrectly or being used in a way that can be almost abused. So essentially, the argument against GAs is that it makes people play the same. Essentially, you take away the uniqueness of things. So in the beginning of this meta, or in the beginning of the game, the meta actually had 3 guns that were being used consistently, and that was the MTZ, the MCW, and the Rival 9. And now the MTZ has been GA'd. The Holger, which was definitely the strongest AR in the game, that's been GA'd. All of the burst ARs in the game have been GA'd. In the beginning, the meta was that everyone would just run with a knife as their secondary. They would not have a pistol or anything. Knives have been GA'd, which I think is probably a good idea, essentially for competitive, because knives are very OP. And now the topic of discussion has essentially centered around smoke grenades and whether teams should be allowed to run them, how many or how often should smoke grenades be used in a hard point map, especially because you would have more time alive and then have more smoke grenades. And obviously hills are the big thing in hard point. It's the whole point of the game. So that's kind of been the talking points right now. I kind of want to get your just general thoughts on GAs. Do you like them? Do you agree with them? What are your thoughts on GAs relating to competitive Call of Duty?
As a whole, I think GAs are a necessary evil. That's always kind of been my opinion on GAs throughout the history of competitive Call of Duty. And that really just boils down to the fact that Call of Duty as a game is made for public multiplayer. It's not a Counter-Strike or, a game like League of Legends that is made with competitive in mind. The competitive community is like just a side note, really, in the eyes of the many developers, at least, not all, but in many cases. It's really a side note and it's not a main priority. And that's where, we go through games in recent years where the weapons stay the same. Super overpowered weapons are just never buffed or nerfed. Overpowered wouldn't be buffed, but you know what I mean? Super overpowered guns aren't nerfed, and then other weapons aren't buffed to a level where they can contend with those overpowered weapons, and the meta stays the same in the competitive community. So, that's where the GAs come in. Do I think in recent years they have gone too far beyond what was probably initially intended with the concept of a GA? Yes, definitely. But there are definitely cases where a GA has been necessary in the past as a measure to keep competitive integrity as high as possible, and as like I already worded it, a necessary evil, because if the developers aren't going to make a change, then it's on the players themselves to try and make the game as entertaining and fair to them as possible, because at the end of the day, they're still competing for thousands and thousands of dollars. So, um, we had events in the past where, even back in Black Ops 2, there was that site where you could like see the outline through walls and stuff like that. And, that would have never been allowed in today's day and age. And that was quickly addressed. I don't know if that was officially banned or if that was just became a GA before GAs were really a thing back then. But for lack of a better example, that's one that comes to mind, because I just remember like on Standoff, you could look through the walls there in that one bomb site with the site, and you could see the outline and stuff like that. It's kind of ridiculous, but um, yeah, I just think in general that GAs are necessary to an extent, but what is happening without being in the conversations ourselves, seemingly from the outside looking in, what's happening this year and other years might be a step beyond what is actually necessary, because sure, there are definitely, like, the Holger seems super just OP and by far the best assault rifle in the game. If that was going to be used, it would probably be a 4 Holger meta just across the board. So in cases like that, I'm not really opposed to them GAing it, although if the developers step in and nerf it a little bit, then we get to the conversation of, will the pros try the Holger again, or is it just going to stay GA'd even if the devs actually do touch it? Stuff like burst assault rifles you mentioned. I've been a huge fan of burst rifles just as a play style, going back to the FAMAS in MW 2009 or MW2 2009. So yeah, I mean, it sucks that we're not going to be able to see them, but if they're one bursting people across the map, then you can't really blame the pros for not wanting to deal with that, when that would just be, wouldn't be fun to watch, and would be stressful to play, all that stuff. So yeah, I think at the end of the day, long-winded way of saying GAs are a necessary evil to an extent. Finding a way to get to the point where we're just not GAing every single thing in the game is, and balancing out the necessary GAs with that is the way that we're going to have to go forward until we get to a point, if we ever do, where we have, a competitive game, kind of like you've said it on the show before, like COD Mobile for the CDL, where it's like historic maps that work well for competitive play with historic guns and all that stuff. If we ever got something like that, it's probably a different conversation, and I don't think that's ever going to happen. But if that day ever comes, maybe that's when GAs will go away. But who knows? Even if we did get a game like that, pros would probably find something to GA too. So, yeah, long-winded answer there, but necessary evil that might be being taken too far, and finding a happy medium between what's a necessary GA and what actually isn't is probably how I view them.
I agree with you on that. They are a necessary evil. I would disagree, or not necessarily disagree. I don't think you said this, but I would add that a big problem with GAs is the lack of transparency among pros, because we are so closed off from the decision-making process. They have, I think, a GA group chat that they basically vote on things that are going to be GA'd or un-GA'd or whatever. But most people in the community don't get to see that. And so we're just getting secondhand, third-hand knowledge of, well, this thing was GA'd today, and we can't use that now. And I think that's frustrating. It's frustrating to me, and I think other people in the community, excuse me, are frustrated by it as well, because we're not privy to the conversations that they're having, the reasoning sometimes behind it, or even just like the way it's communicated to people can come off as like very condescending, and the way, because pros are very defensive about this. Like even something as simple as the Sib Killa thing from that we talked about last week, like there was no reason that Sib should have been so aggressive with that when Killa was just making a anti-GA statement. That just seemed over the top, but I think there are a lot of pros that have that kind of defensive mindset about it. Slasher is a good example of someone who, we live in the Slasher World League. This is his league. We're just in it. And, obviously people joke about that stuff. And I think that's just because he's been vocal about GAs and how important they are. But there are definitely people that are going to use that against him or say that he is using it to his benefit, which I don't know if Slasher specifically is doing this, but it definitely feels like pros, and this is not just a new thing. I think this has probably been a thing for years, that pros use these GAs to protect their interests and their interests as a team, as a player. That if I can GA this or we can get this certain thing out of the meta, then that's better for our team. Maybe it's not the best idea for competitive in general, but this will help our team. And that's just complete BS. Like that's a horrible way. That's a reason why that's a reason why you wouldn't have the NBA players or every single NBA player be able to vote on rule changes, because then the players themselves could affect the rule changes and make it so, well, if I want to get 35 free throws a night, then I'm going to have this rule change. So like flopping is actually worth 3 free throws, not 2, or something ridiculous like that. And you have, well, this is another reason to have a union would be you have people that are representing you when the league comes down and says, well, we don't want to ban this. And then you have a actual body that can say, no, we want this banned. And I think that's another reason why the pros need some kind of representation or something solid, because if you, like we saw with last year, if you break it down, if you out these people as these are the votes for the GA, these are votes against GA, then fans go after them. And that's how you fracture anybody. And I think it was a map or something. I forget what the exact reason for this was, but the GA got broken essentially, or got voted out because people were shamed to let another map in. I think it was that control map, the DLC control map that got added in. And I'm pretty sure that was originally going to be GA'd by the players, and something happened, and it was basically they got shamed and guilted into doing it. But to get back to my original point, players are working in their self-interest, as they probably should, but that's also not the best for the game. It's not best for the game to have as few of guns as possible, because right now the MCW is pretty much the only AR that's being used, which isn't great. If we could have the MTZ and we could have the MCW, that'd be awesome, but we're not at that point. If we could have the Rival 9 and we could have the Striker, that would be nice, but the devs have not balanced it in a way where that's actually beneficial for anyone. I'm kind of over GAs in general right now, and I just want some player to just spawn in with the most ridiculous thing ever. I don't even know if so Holgers are not banned in the competitive rule set. I'm not sure if burst ARs are either, and like that's not a good thing, because those things are actually very OP. If you just go into a pub, you can test it out yourself and you're like, wow, this is a really good gun. And I'm not saying that we can't have good guns, but devs need to be more on top of it, and then the GAs become less of an issue. But yeah, I think that was really the whole ban protect stuff from BO3. I think the system was actually fine, but I mean there just weren't enough base bans or good enough base bans to where it actually became useful, because I don't think you really like the ban protect from BO3, but I just thought like if the devs were really on top of it and they were able to ban the things that should have been banned, then the ban protect system actually works and it becomes something, something unique. It almost becomes like a League of Legends ban protect, but instead of champions, you have guns that you can't use. So in this case, you can't use the MCW, and everybody's got to figure out which AR they're going to use on this map. Or you can't use Dead Silence in search. Well, this is going to be the slowest, like campiest S&D you've ever seen. I think that stuff has a place in Call of Duty, but it goes back to this idea that the devs just aren't supportive enough, and they probably won't ever be. unless we get a game like what you and I were describing is like COD Mobile. That is a separate game, something completely unrelated to the newest money-making game in Call of Duty. But we're just probably never going to get that, and we just kind of have to deal with the hands that we're being dealt with. And that's unfortunate because it creates a lot of divisiveness in the community over what we should GA, when we should GA, when we should reevaluate it. And that was my last point that I was going to bring up is that Octane and Ben Nassim, I don't know how to say his last name, but they were on stream the other day and they were talking about GAs, and that they both agreed that pros will not reevaluate GAs, especially the Holger and the Burst ARs, even if those get nerfed and they're actually more in line with the MCW, those will not be reintroduced at any point. Or maybe the Holger might, but the Burst GA or the Burst ARs definitely won't be because people just don't want to play against them, which is not good for competitive, but that's just, again, my opinion. I don't know if you had any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, first off, I looked at the rule set real quick, and the Holger is officially banned in the CDL rule set, but not the burst rifles or the MTZ. So that is, if the Holger is straight up banned, then that's probably never coming off that list, even if it does get nerfed. Kind of like you were saying, it probably wouldn't even be tested at that point afterwards, but it could be. Who knows? Second point you were making there is you got it a little twisted in your memory of my thoughts on Black Ops 3 because I was a huge fan of Ban and Protect. I was even in similar situations. I don't think I would ban Dead Silence, but I'm pretty sure Afterburner was the perk that kept your like when you were jetpacking, it would keep like the circle ping off the mini map or whatever. I would ban that to make people try to have to keep boots on the ground as much as possible. So I was a little trolly with some of the ban and protect stuff, but I really liked ban and protect. If there was a balanced way to address that, I think that would be interesting to see if that would be able to be implemented in competitive play again to some extent. But yeah, no, I think we're kind of on the same page with GAs and for the most part, and even if this is the predominant conversation of this podcast episode, it's not like there's really anything that we or anybody's going to do about it until, major changes are made to competitive Call of Duty as a whole, kind of like we're saying, getting that dev support that's needed to the point where GAs aren't necessary or anything like that. Outside of that happening, it's just going to be a continual conversation.
Yeah, the last thing I really want to talk about related to GAs are smoke grenades, because this has been kind of the last day or two that's been a lot of what pros have been talking about and whether they should be implemented into competitive. Abizi had the idea of making the smoke grenade a field upgrade with a 60-second cooldown, so you get one every minute. In hardpoint, that's pretty much one per hardpoint, or roughly. And I think that could work. I haven't seen enough of actual scrims with smoke grenades, so it's kind of hard to even say as a viewer what I would prefer in this game. In general, I am a big proponent of smoke grenades. I'm a big proponent of trophy systems, EMPs, flashes, stuns, like everything, and obviously lethal grenades and or frag grenades and Semtexes. I love it. I think the equipment it makes it unique. I think you should have one generally every life, but that's also, I really fell in love with competitive in Black Ops 2. So you could get a trophy system every life. The field upgrade system was not in place at that point. You would, but that would also that was your tactical. Yeah, so you're tactical. So you don't have a stun, you don't have a flash, you don't have an EMP, but you have a trophy. At some point, we had the Black Hat system, or the Black Hat equipment thing, which is kind of like what DDoS is now. DDoS is, or it's kind of some mixture of EMP and Black Hat, but that's also something that's being GA'd, and people don't really want it in the into the meta. But I think all of that stuff is great. Of course, it can be spammy, and you have to figure out ways of going around that. But I really don't like the system of well, this team can't have four, smoke grenades. Like you can only have one per player, or one per team essentially, and that's something that has been discussed, not necessarily about smokes but trophies. Like you can only have two players out of your four have a trophy system. But I think that all of it goes back to bad development, and maybe not even bad development because this is the way that they probably wanted to do it, but bad development for competitive. Because I personally think that trophy system should be gone after, say, two hits essentially. Like two grenades can break a trophy system, because then you could have a frag grenade and you could have a stun grenade, and you can't hit anybody, but you've broken their trophy system, and that can cancel each other out. And that's what competitive is all about anyway, having counters to an offensive strategy, and neither one of those be super overpowered. Did you have any thoughts on smoke grenades and kind of how they can be implemented into competitive? Because there have been smokes in previous CODs and previous competitive metas. So how do you think it would fit into MW3 if it was allowed?
Yeah, I like smoke grenades as a concept. Especially in my background with S&D, using smokes to smoke off a bomb site and get the bomb down, and then 2 rounds later you throw a smoke at that same bomb site. The whole other team is rushing to that site thinking you're there, and it's just a giant fake. You're going to the other site. I like that competitive aspect of smoke grenades. The biggest problem with smoke grenades in recent years have just been that they're super broken and haven't worked as well, I shouldn't say as intended, because I believe one of the developers over the last year said it actually was intended when there was one ways. Um, but they just haven't worked properly is the better way to say. And that's one weighing in a smoke. When a player throws a smoke and they're standing in the smoke and they can see through the smoke at somebody, but the person on the other side of the smoke can't see the person in the smoke, that can't happen. So if that's how smokes are working in MW3, then they have no place in the game in that form until that's addressed. But if the smokes are actually, viable and not super broken to that extent, as I, previously just illustrated, then finding a way to incorporate them in the current meta would definitely be, you know, something I would be for. I do like a BZ suggestion of a field upgrade with a 60-second cooldown, especially for hardpoint, like you mentioned, because that if you made it so that one person on each team has the smoke grenade, 60-second cooldown, you get one smoke per hill on hardpoint. Would be interesting to see how that cooldown would work in S&D and um control conversely, but um I think the bigger issues there is it would just never happen. I feel like in COD development, like there's no world where the competitive scene would get a smoke grenade or any item as a field upgrade when it's in the game as a tactical. Like that's just a drastic change that I don't think the developers would like put in the game to that extent. Um, so I like the concept. I just don't think it would actually happen. But if it did, that could be something interesting. I do think though finding a way to try and balance that or experiment a little with the smokes could be beneficial. But if there are larger problems with the smokes to the point of like people getting one weight and stuff like that, then I don't think that has any room for or any place in competitive play. That would just not be great. So. Um, yeah, I think that's just goes back to our point during the GA conversation about getting the development support. But with smokes in particular, like I don't remember which day. It might have been Greg actually, from Sledgehammer, but um, I feel like there's one dev when they were talking about smokes is like that joke was it was intended or whatever was happening. So, um, yeah, there's been some questionable decisions over the years, and um this is might just be one example, but it's definitely a case here where if the smokes are viable and are an answer that could fit in the meta, at least trying them out and seeing how it works could be something I would be for. But obviously, at the end of the day, a lot of these pros know a lot more about COD than me. So, if an overwhelming majority don't think that smokes have a place in the game, there's got to be a reason for that. Even if like you were kind of saying, some might have self-centered intentions behind certain GAs, but if an overwhelming majority of the pros and even amateurs to an extent are saying like, yeah, no smokes, then I feel like there has to be some validity behind that. It can't just all be, smoke and mirrors for lack of a better phrase.
Yeah. Tremor said in the Twitch chat, and this was a little bit ago when we were talking about the more of the other GAs. He said Treyarch comes closest to that, especially with 4 years of dev. Um, I mean, I'm really looking forward to what Treyarch can cook up. I know that they're not the perfect dev. It's not like they give us literally everything we want and exactly how we want it. But as far as COD developers go, they are by far the best. And we've sung their praises on many occasions, both on this show and just like in general. And there's a lot of optimism and a lot of hope riding on Treyarch's next game. But that's something that we're gonna have to live with and hope that it all works out for the best when they do release it next year, this around this time. Um, let's get through some of this random stuff that we have listed on this on our notes. Last thing that we'll go to the Parasite one because it's more in line with what we were just talking about. But this was his quote about the GAs and what has been happening with modern COD versus, or not modern COD, because what he's comparing it to is MW 2019, which is definitely modern COD as well. But what he said is maybe if we stop trying to force the way we played one COD on every single one, we'll finally open our eyes to what works for this specific iteration. We are trying to play MW 2019 maps with new generation GAs. It's not going to work no matter how you tweak the game. I think that's a good point. It's like,
I think he means MW
yeah,
2009 there.
yeah. I think I was about to say he definitely is not talking about MW 2019 because Hackney Yard is not in this game, and London Docks definitely not in this game. But yeah, I think he's trying to say the 2009 maps we're trying to play with new generation GAs. It's just like a completely different game. I said it when we were talking about the beta. I've said it a few times since then. COD now is completely different to how it was 15 years ago, and you can every map even looks different. Like some of them look better, but they all look different in the end. The guns are different. The way we move in the game is completely different, and I think GAs, the best solution for GAs in general would just be to have an open mind about what you're going to GA in a certain game and what you're not, and what you're willing to deal with in a game versus what you're not. I don't know where the pros should come down on that, because again, like what you just said, pros are much more knowledgeable about COD and how it should play, or what's the best way to play than we are in general. But at the same time, they have to kind of weigh what is the most entertaining way for the fans versus the most entertaining way for the players. Those things don't always align, and that can always kind of cause some kind of divide in the community. I don't know if you had any thoughts on what Parasite said as related to GAs.
No, I mean I think that's an interesting point. If he truly did mean the 2009 maps, like we're assuming there, it is an interesting point and something we've talked about on the show in terms of like the game modes, not even actually like specifically how the maps played, but just something we talked about over the last couple of months is we're playing Hardpoint, which is now arguably well, it is the most popular respawn mode. You can make an argument that a lot of people prefer it over search to some extent, but a mode that's being played twice in best of fives is being played on maps that weren't designed when that mode was created. So that's just something we've been talking about for months now, and even Octane, just going into one of the other things we had mentioned in the notes, he mentioned the Palace Hill on Invasion. He tweeted, surely we're not going to watch CDL teams attempt to break Palace Hill on Invasion all year using strictly gun skill, right? And he got some responses from JCap in there. But it kind of raises that point that these games weren't, or this mode of Hardpoint wasn't around when these maps were being played years ago and over a decade ago. So there's bound to be some issues, especially we're trying to force a mode onto these maps. But some maps it's going to work better on than others, and that's been slightly reflected in the map pool. But it's definitely going to be interesting to see how these maps play out, especially with some of these hard points and that one hill like Octane mentioned, because I felt that way about playing it in pubs. Like I try to rotate with like 20 seconds left on P4 to get to that Palace Hill and invasion, just because it feels like it's a super hill, and it's kind of, you can just set up there, block people off, and I'm definitely interested to see how that one plays out. And it could be a candidate for a hill change if that does happen. We had that. What was the snow map in Cold War? I can't think of it off the top of my head. But we had several hill changes on that map where they brought one from in the back down low, and then I think that map even might have got removed. I can't think of the name though. But it's something that's happened previously, and it could be a candidate where some of these other maps that are added with the seasons might join the pool if they are actually better for hardpoint. Who knows? But yeah, it's definitely an interesting conversation nonetheless, just as a general idea of how these maps are going to play. Crossroads, thank you, Chummy.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of those maps, especially for hardpoint, are just like they're going to be interesting because you could actually full 60 off of it. I mentioned it on, I think, on the last episode, but Burger Town in Terminal just seems like honestly the most frustrating hill ever to exist. It just is not something that I would want to deal with. Also, even library, even though there are 2 points, like you can pretty much see all of the mid map and all of the hallway. Like there's so many choke points on that map that it can be pretty frustrating to play against, I'm sure. But it's going to make for entertaining competitive COD, and maybe that's all that really matters. Maybe we can drive some of the players insane a little bit just by making them play some of the worst the ill-fitted maps that definitely are not set up to be hardpoint maps. Maybe that'll just work out the best for us. But yeah, Invasion P5 is definitely gonna be pretty interesting to watch. Let's talk about this rumored update that there's going to be a big update coming after the new year, and or after the second match of the CDL season, but that's pretty much around the New Year or Christmas time. I think this would be really, really interesting if we could get a big update. Of course, this is not necessarily that important for competitive like in the near future, because if there's a big update that drops, there is a big update coming in just a week and a half. When we get to December 6th, and we get to see what's going to happen with season one's launch and what's coming in the patch and all of the content and stuff. That really won't matter for competitive because the pros are probably not going to play on any of that patch until after, I would imagine. Maybe that's not the case. Right before we went on air, I said maybe we don't really know what's going to happen with some of these things because this is competitive COD. Anything can happen when it comes to these patches and who's playing on what patch, especially with the lands and everything. But this big patch is supposed to be coming around the new year, and Scrappy said we need more than a big update. We need a whole new game. I don't know if I necessarily agree. I think some of these maps are fine, but what do you think about that? Do you think we need a whole new game for competitive?
I mean, hey, I haven't played any, GBs or anything like that in this game yet, besides my pubs and zombies. But it's definitely an interesting take out of Scrap. My bigger takeaway from this is, the next tweet we have linked there, uh, calling back to Aches and MW 2019. There were rumors in that time too about there being a big update. And I remember, I'm pretty sure like LAG just like wasn't scrimming because they were like, we're not gonna play on this old patch when a huge update is coming that's gonna completely change the game. And then that update never came, and LAG didn't get off to a strong start. Aches was soon benched after, and the rest is history. So, it's kind of a little bit of a similar situation here, where like some of the older pros, I think Slasher might have commented on either the Scrappy tweet or Aces tweet. He's like, they're not fooling me this time. So yeah, there's some jokes going around about whether an actual big update will happen or not. But in all seriousness, we were kind of talking before we went live. There will be updates to Call of Duty MW3 over the next month. The question will be, will they be the quote unquote big update, and will they actually majorly impact competitive play? So season 1 of MW3 goes live on December 6th. The first matches for the CDL are December 8th. We are assuming that uh, at least for these first couple weeks of the CDL online qualifiers, they probably wouldn't play on the season 1 patch. They would play on the season 0 patch that's live right now. That's just speculation based on what has previously happened in the CDL to our knowledge, but that's probably a strong likelihood of that happening. If that isn't the case, we will definitely hear about it on Twitter, because pros will inevitably be complaining about playing on an update 2 days after it drops.
Surely not.
And then we have a little break due to Christmas and the holidays before we get back into the qualifiers. So the first 2 weeks will start on December 8th. They will go through December 17th, and then we resume on January 12th. The last set of qualifiers there would be on January 21st, before the major. I think the major is the 25th to the 28th. And due to the way that Call of Duty as a game has done these seasonal updates, where they do season update, a mid-season reloaded update halfway through the season, and then the following month they do the next season. Usually we're looking at an early January, or if season 1 starts December 6th, a season 1 reloaded update might happen in the first couple weeks of January, which could impact the matches played at the start of the Major 1 qualifiers resuming after the holiday break. There's potential for 2 updates to take place before we get to our first mate. Well, 2 updates to MW3 will happen before the first LAN tournament is played in the CDL this year. Again, the question of whether the pros will play on those patches, which one they'll play on, if those are major changes for competitive, all that is up in the air. It's just a fact, though. 2 updates will have taken place in some capacity. One will definitely happen. The mid-season update will most likely happen before we get to LAN. So yeah, it's a question of whether this quote-unquote big update for competitive will actually happen. When will it happen? When will it be implemented in competitive play and these qualifier matches, or the LAN? Lots of questions around it. And going back to that Aches example, it just never happened back then. So is it possible that that same thing happens here, and history repeats itself in 2023? We'll have to stay tuned and find out.
Yeah, I think it would be best if we could line up the events and the matches with these updates a little bit better, because then we could actually play matches on current meta, or as current as you can be. I know League of Legends does, they're kind of like a patch behind every, like, isn't that right? With like LCS will play on like, say, 10.2, and then like we'll be on 10.3 or 10.4.
To an extent, yeah. I don't know when that exactly happens, because obviously, like at the start of the year, no, maybe it does happen right away with the start of the season. They'll play on like 14.1 when 14.2 is out. But yeah, there definitely is some overlap there in League, where like they're playing a patch behind, and then even for like the World Championship just happened, they cap it off at a certain number. I can't remember if it's 17 or 19. But they cap it off, and then the regular game still goes through its bi-weekly patches, but that just doesn't impact the World Championship.
Yeah, I think if we could figure out something akin to that in Call of Duty, where we're playing, so say the season 1 patch comes out on December 6th, and we're playing on, well, preferably season 1 would come on December 6th, and we could just have the competitive season start right after that, or play matches on the season 0 patch, and then we can kind of be on the same schedule, because I think 4 to 6 weeks on a patch is actually very good. And if we could get, say we play season 0, right? We play season 0 from December 6th to January 1st, or until the winter break. And then after the winter break, everybody's playing on the season 1 patch for the rest of the Major 1 cycle, including Major 1, and probably not going to play on the reloaded patch and just start at season 2, or maybe play a little bit on season 1 reloaded after Major 1. Something like that could work. It would just need a lot more communication from the devs to the pro teams or the CDL in general, so everybody can kind of be ready for it and it's not a surprise like, oh my god, this is so different from what we've been playing on. We can't play on this until, a month or two from now. We just have matches that we have to get through, and we can't start practicing on these new weapons that are the meta weapons now. So it's kind of a mess, and that's just competitive COD in general. Something I do want to talk about before we get out of here is Nadeshot. Has been playing these old man retired 8s. I know he's been playing with like Nameless and Slacked and all of them, and they've been testing out certain settings or certain restrictions, and not in the general sense of, well, you can't use this gun, but more, or this certain gun, but more that they tried out 2 ARs and 2 subs, so you actually have to run those weapons. And they tried DDoS and trophies as well. Just they're more experimenting with the competitive settings in more of a way than the pros probably can, because they kind of have to expect what they're going to do and play how they're expecting to play, where the old men essentially can do whatever they want and test things out for their amusement. Nadeshot said that the 2 AR 2 subs meta was, quote, substantially better than what we've been playing, and 4 subs was even more fun than that. He said DDoS should be used to counter trophies as well, in my opinion. I would love, I don't know about 4 SMGs necessarily, because I think it's pretty fun to watch ARs, but if we could force, I would honestly be in favor of just forcing a 3-gun meta and just forcing one player on the MTZ or whatever flex gun you want to use, have one player on an AR and then 2 players on a sub, and that's just kind of the meta that we rock with, or 2 ARs, 2 subs, however you want to break it down. But I don't want either 4 ARs, which is kind of what we're getting now, and a lot of pro players have been saying that's more the meta than 4 SMGs, because the MCW is so much stronger and it's better in general than the subs. So what's your take on it? Do you think pros should kind of adopt this 2 AR 2 sub meta, or some kind of variation of that?
I don't think necessarily they should adopt it. I think it's an interesting idea, and just as a counterpoint to your 3 weapon suggestion with 4 players on a team, at that point you might as well just go make the swap to pro mod and have a sniper running around the map, right? So
I'm in.
there's some interesting conversations to be had around that. Do I think anything would happen substantially in that regard this season? Probably not. But it's definitely an interesting idea, especially as an alternative to seeing MCWs or ACRs on the map. The one thing this reminded me though of is, I don't remember the full history of this, but I do remember before, it was either before Infinite Warfare came out or right at the start of it, there was discussions of a weapon draft being implemented where players were only going to be able to use 1 weapon per team. And I remember, I'm pretty sure I wrote an article about it back then, but I was like, somebody like Classic is going to be super valuable because you can almost just give him any gun at that stage, and you give him a sub, he'll be good. You give him the best AR, he can perform. You give him an AR that's not the best one, he can still put up numbers. And same argument with the sub. So I don't remember exactly how that all went down in history. IW is kind of a blur at this point for me. But there have been conversations similar to this where we're putting more harsh restrictions on what players can use beyond like band attachments and stuff. This would actually hard limit you to 2 ARs or 2 subs, or in the case of that old weapon draft that didn't really come to fruition, limiting a player to 1 specific gun for that map. I think actually now I'm kind of remembering, because I believe at the start of IW games there was like, it wasn't necessarily a draft, but like you would pick your character, or or specialist that you would use before that. Because I remember there's like FTL jump. There was the invisible stuff that was super OP. You would just go invis and dunk the uplink ball, and you couldn't even see the outline of the guy at one point. Camo. I don't know why I'm saying invisible. Um, so I think like that's where I think like part of that draft was going to be a weapon and specialist involved. But regardless, that's just what this reminded me of. I do think it's a cool idea if we were able to, hard say, like we were talking about Seattle earlier when we were doing our power rankings. If you had this implemented, it kind of handicaps what that team is able to do. Somebody like Illy, who can use a sub and an AR. A player like GodRx we've talked about on Carolina, even someone like Kenny, who's really done well with ARs and sub historically in his career. Draza, Celium, probably more Draza at this point, but there's definitely players where it would be interesting to see how it impacted them. But setting a hard limit like that could just be one of the only alternatives to this potential ACR meta that might be looming. But at the end of the day, like I was saying, yeah, it's just more of an interesting idea, concept to talk about, and I don't think anything will actually come of it. Certainly not at the professional level.
Yeah, I think the 2 sub 2 AR meta would actually be the best course of action in COD anyway, because it would even out the distribution of AR and sub players, right? Like for the last, several years, there's been an abundance of submachine gun players, and obviously there are flex players, but there seem to be fewer and fewer main AR players, and there's only so many spots that they can have in the league, especially because we haven't gotten expansion. So you have really talented AR players that are being left out of the league because there are just so many more submachine gun players, or at least like that's what they're being used for. So if we just went 2-2, that would work. If you wanted to do it for S&D and, not necessarily pro mod, but if you wanted to force a sniper on one player per team, I know people have been complaining about snipers in this game and how they're kind of OP, but snipers in Search are fun to watch. So I think that should just be like, you should never GA or ban snipers in Search. I think that's just something that should just be a part of what we do as competitive COD fans and what we enjoy. So, but yeah, I would be cool with a 2-2. Again, like you said, I don't think that's happening. I think it's more of an experimentation thing, and it is good to know, especially because you have trusted players and community members contributing to this. But at the same time, I think we're in agreement that it's probably just not going to happen for competitive at least anytime soon. We're at just a bit over an hour. I don't know if you wanted to get to any of this other stuff, but I think that's about it. We've covered the LAG stuff, the power rankings or the tier list, and we've talked about quite a bit related to GAs and the meta that's happening in MW3. We're at just about 70 minutes, so we'll wrap up here. We will be back next week, and we will be giving our predictions for the matches, the first set of qualifying matches of Major 1 of the first set of matches of the CDL season. We're finally here, or we're almost here. We're also going to give our predictions for who we think is going to win COD Champs at the end of the year, who's going to win MVP, who's going to win Rookie of the Year. We might have some other categories that we think up that are not necessarily CDL awards, but we definitely have a few things to make our predictions on and to talk about as we get even closer to the beginning of the season. Make sure to subscribe, like, or follow the podcast feed wherever you're listening or watching on. Make sure to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you're on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, like the video, share the video, and please subscribe to the YouTube channel Follow us on Twitter. He's at jbink with 2Ks. I'm at Pres Byers, and the podcast Twitter is at Ego Chall Podcast. The next show will be sometime early next week, preferably. We've been doing them on Mondays or Tuesdays for the last month or so, but we would definitely be doing a show next week, and we would definitely be giving our predictions for all of the matches for week 1. That does it for me. Bink, take it away.
Yeah, thank you guys as always. Hope you enjoyed the show today. Hope you're looking forward to all the content coming your way as we, finally get underway with the 2024 season in a very short amount of time. So it should be fun. Let us know if you have any feedback, good or bad. We're here for any suggestions you have that, help us provide you guys what you want to listen or watch. So, with that, we'll see you next time. And remember to send the chow.